Well, welcome back, folks. I'm now preparing to media blast with sodium bicarbonate the left and right engine cases for the Honda SL125. They're completely stripped, with the exception on the left case, the neutral switch, which is right there. I'm pointing to. I'm not going to remove that. I'm going to mask that off carefully and do the media blasting. These are not painted. They're just going to be cleaned really well inside and out, and then rinsed in water, blown out. I will then chase any threads, any passages, any openings around the two cases to make sure there is no remaining blast media. And then I'll take some quadruple aught, that'd be 4-aught steel wool and WD-40, and then I will polish the engine cases to seal the pores, and then they will be ready for the beginning of the process of reassembly of the engine. I still am rounding up a few pieces. The bearings, this one right here, this is the one I had to create that little puller, that little plug puller to remove the bearing. That's of course right here. That I've got to order yet. In fact, the bearings, all the bearings for the transmission, I have to order yet. So it'll take a couple days to get those in. So that'll give me time to get these cases all cleaned up. So we'll come back on the other side when I got the cases cleaned up and about ready for reassembly. It's been a couple of weeks since my last video on the Honda SL125. And during that time, I've been continuing to round up various bits and pieces and parts I need to start putting the engine back together. And I've had a few home projects around that I had to take care of here before we start heading into the fall. It's very late summer right now as I'm recording this video, so I had a few things I needed to get done. Nonetheless, and some of this might be a little redundant, so you'll have to just bear with me, but I think I've got everything now ready to go. You know, the engine cases we've talked about before. I've rounded up new bearings right here. These are the main bearings. These are new Honda bearings. I was not able to get new bearings, well, not easily anyway, from my local bearing supply house that I normally would have bought my bearings from, simply because since this whole COVID-19 situation we've all been dealing with for almost 6 months, they really have stopped taking walk-in customers. You have to order online, and they're really designed to support commercial businesses, not individuals like me, even though they've been willing to support my business. And it became a fair amount of hassle to get the bearings I needed from them, so I just went and ordered a new Honda bearings, the right part numbers, and then I'm also assured of the quality. So I've got the main bearings, got the cases cleaned. I've got all the other components arrayed around here. The kickstart shaft, the crank, clutch basket, shift lever, transmission, and transmission shift drum. So what I'm going to do next is do a little review of each one of these components. I'll get these engine halves out of the way, and we'll talk through briefly each one of these items I just referenced. By the way, I believe that by the time I'm done, this engine, when it's complete, will be made up of at least 4 different engines. The original cases, the cylinder and the head came, of course, from the original engine. The kickstart shaft is NOS because the original had damaged splines. I'll get back to that in a minute. Crankshaft came from a second engine. Clutch basket came from a third engine. The transmission, shift drum, and shift lever, which is a replacement because the splines on the original were also damaged, came from the fourth engine. So we have at least 4 engines plus a multitude of NOS parts that will be used. Let me get these cases out of the way, and then we'll talk about these other items in a little more detail. As I indicated, the bearings are brand new from Honda. I did have to wait about 10 days for this shielded bearing. The parts diagrams indicate it wasn't available, and another diagram said it was available. Long story short, it was available from Honda, so I've got new bearings. The kickstart shaft spindle, this is an NOS part right here because the splines on the original were in very poor condition, as very common. And the spring right here, this big return spring, that is NOS also. Neither one of these parts, well, at least the spring for sure is not available from Honda. The shaft, the spindle might be, if I recall, I've looked at so many different diagrams and part numbers, it might still be available, but it was real expensive. The rest of these parts, these gears, and other components are the originals. I just cleaned up and transferred over from the original kickstart shaft. The crankshaft we have talked about before. This is obviously used. I am not going to replace the bearings because they're in very good condition. They both sound fine. There's really nothing wrong with the crankshaft. I did check the end-play specifications and it's within spec. The clutch basket I really haven't done much with, and I won't get into this in detail until I get to reinstalling the clutch. I'll pull all the plates out, I'll mic them, make sure they're within specification, look at the overall condition of them as well as the springs, and I'll reuse them if they're well within specs and there's no damage to them. Otherwise, the clutch plates will be replaced. The shift shaft assembly right here is a good used item. This is essentially the way I got it. I haven't really done much with this either. You know, all the hardware that goes with it right here. Nice clean splines, as you can see there, which is why I had to replace it. The transmission. Here's the transmission. This is basically as I got it. I did put this little piece of wire around to hold everything together, but I have inspected all the gears and all the teeth are intact. There's no major wear to any of them, and I think this will be pretty much a drop-in replacement. I did order new thrust washers for the ends from Honda, which is still available. And the shift drum, which came with the transmission, is also in very good condition, of course used. And the shift forks, they'll have to be cleaned up a little bit more before I mount it, but I think that will be a nice addition to the bike as well. My next step will be to mount the bearings and the crankcase halves, so I'm going to end up cleaning up the crankcase one last time to make sure, because it's been sitting for a couple of weeks, make sure no dust or debris has gotten into where the bearings will fit and it's good and clean, and then I'm going to install the bearings before I can put the crank and the transmission and the rest of the components together. The crankcase is all cleaned up again, hit them with brake cleaner and then blew them off thoroughly with clean, dry, compressed air. A couple of things I want to talk about, and that's primarily drillings. There are oil passage drillings in these cases on both of them. On the left case, you can see right where I'm pointing right there, that drilling, that's to supply oil to the back side of that shielded blind bearing that I had to make that little puller for a video or two back to pull that bearing out. That passage comes out up here, way down in there, and you can't see it where I'm pointing to right there. So you want to make sure that that's clean and open. On the right case, there are a number of drillings. You have one right here that supports this bushing, and that comes out up here where I'm pointing to. There are two up near the cylinder where the cylinder mounts. This one I'm pointing to right here passes through and comes out way down inside of there. And then this one, which supplies oil to the top end of the engine and the cylinder head, comes out right here. There's also down here, coming from the oil pump, right here on this side, at exits or the entrance is right here on this side. So you got what, 4 oil drillings, passages, and between the two Actually, I think there's 5 between the two engine cases. Last thing I want to mention is I found this little piece of broken off casting right here. I found this way down in the bottom of this left engine half, left case. And I had to dig around and fish around a little bit and do some sleuthing to determine it actually came from right here. It originally fit, I think, something like that. I have no idea why it broke off, but obviously it just dropped down to the bottom of the engine and been there for many years. It was actually encrusted in there pretty well. I had to kind of pry it out, the old sludge from the bottom of the engine. I don't think it's going to make any difference or hurt anything. I'm just going to move on with the project. I think it was just part of the casting that was in a non-critical position. So now I've got the castings cleaned, made sure all the oil passage orifices are open. I'm going to put each of these cases in the oven, in my shop oven, warm them up to around 200 plus degrees Fahrenheit. And I have the bearings in the house freezer, and then I'm going to go ahead and put the bearings in. I'm not going to necessarily show that, but that's the process I'm going to work. Now a couple hours later, I had a little lunch in there, so it didn't take me very long to actually install the bearings. What did take a little time was heating the cases. So each of these cases was heated to around 200 plus degrees Fahrenheit for about 30 minutes, 45 minutes or so, and then I'd had the bearings in the freezer, and then it was a matter of putting them together. The bearings in the left case, I did have to gently tap them in. You can see them there. They were just a slight interference fit, as you might expect. The bearing in the right case, I almost dropped in. I just had gloves on, of course, because the case was hot. But I just took my fingers and I had to just push it into place, this bearing. And once everything is normalized, everything's a nice tight fit. So I'll go ahead and blow it off one more time, make sure there's no debris, and then I will begin the process of installing the internals, that being the crankshaft, the transmission, shift drum, etc. I'm going to have to review the reassembly procedure. I've got 2 service manuals, a Honda factory manual and then a third-party service manual. I think it's a Climber, I believe. It's around here somewhere to find it. And I'm not sure they necessarily agree on the process of putting this engine back together, so I've got to square that up in my own mind. I will bring you back on the other side when I've got most of this ready to go back together. That is, the 2 halves to fit back together. I have the crankcases about ready to go back together. Transmission's installed, shift drum, and of course the crankshaft. The transmission right now is a neutral, and I know you can't see it, but way down in here where I'm pointing to is my left index finger, is a little brass tab or plate that's on the bottom of the shift drum. That when the transmission is in neutral, or should be in neutral, that brass plate on the bottom of the shift drum aligns with that brass pickup coming from the neutral light that goes through the case, and the wire on the opposite side or outside the case will connect to. It is a neutral, so if I hold on the bottom, I know again you can't see it, but if I hold the output shaft, which is the opposite side of this shaft right here, with my left hand and spin this shaft, you can see that it's in neutral right now. I have shifted it through all 5 gears, starting with neutral. It's a little bit stiff because I've got to rotate this shift drum by hand. I don't really have a lot of leverage. It's a little bit slippery because I've got a lot of assembly lubing here as I put everything back together. But for instance, right there is first gear, and then back to neutral, and you can see these gears are shifting up and down as I rotate this shift drum back to neutral. And then I can keep going around first, second, third, fourth and fifth, and then rotate right back to neutral, which is about right there. So it has been shifted probably half a dozen times. Again, it's in neutral right now. If I put it in first gear, for instance, now let me get my hands out of the way. Now the output shaft, that's this one right here, is powered from this shaft. So as I turn this shaft, you will see this shaft now will in fact turn. Actually, it would go like this. This is the way it's going to be driven. If I bring it back to neutral, get the oil off my hands. If I bring it back to neutral, right there, now you'll notice the shaft won't spin when I rotate. See that? The shaft is not spinning, so it's back in neutral. So I've tested the transmission, have this case I think ready to go, and the crankshaft was just a simple drop-in. There really wasn't much to that. You can see nice and smooth. Let's shift over to the right case here. Right case is ready to go also. The shift mechanism, shift shaft, which you see I'm pointing to in the lower right corner of your screen, that's that new NOS shift shaft that I installed. This mounts in the right case and is held in place because this right case will be flipped over like this onto the left. This is actually held in place with spring tension. So there's this return arrangement here. And so there's really no danger of this falling out unless I was to get very rough with it when I rotate it over and mount the two pieces together. I do have the gasket, and as I think I alluded to once before, Honda, at least on this model, is a little bit unusual, at least in my experience. Most of the at least the two-stroke manufacturers tend not to use gaskets, and they just use gasket sealant around the edges of the case here. But Honda does in fact obviously use a gasket. And I will, before I put this together, the last thing I'll do is lubricate or smear a coating of anti-seize all over the gasket to make it supple and to allow it to be removed easily in the future if this engine never has to be resplit. I'm not going to use a gasket sealant per se, like you would, the spray-on kind or the brush-on kind of sealants. I'm going to use the anti-seize compound. One other thing on the gasket, you want to make sure that all the holes are all cut out or punched out properly so that all your passages are open, because in some cases you might notice, let me just lay this in place here, there are some openings like where I'm pointing to with my left index finger that align with the oil passage drillings. So you want to make sure you get everything punched out, because quite often they're not all punched out. They're punched, but the core has not been removed. So you want to make sure you do that. The shift mechanism, that is the shaft that goes through the case and out on the left side that the shift pedal attaches to, will mount on the outside of the right case. So that will not be installed until these cases are back together. The only thing I have left to do now before I marry the two is to, again, lubricate with anti-seize this gasket. I will have to cut out here where my thumbs are to allow for this to clear around where the connecting rod comes through. That's just a bridge, and I'll remove that. And I'll position the gasket on the left case, and then it's just a matter of pulling the two pieces together. Also, I have new alignment dowels. You can see I'm pointing to, well, let me move this back. I have two alignment dowels, my left index finger, my right index finger. These are new. They're still available from Honda. The originals were very rusty, and I had to fight them a little bit to get out. And these are very inexpensive, so I just bought new ones, and I coated them liberally with anti-seize, again, where they fit into the block. And I actually do on this side as well. to allow for easy removal in the future, again, if that's ever necessary. So dowel pins are in place, gasket's got to be lubricated with anti-seize, kickstart shaft is in place, transmission's been verified, shift drums in place and verified, crankshaft is ready to go, so all we've got left to do is put this together.